This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. And one of the exciting programs we have is called Renewing Illinois, in which we invite university students from across the state to come and discuss the future of Illinois. We'd hoped to have a great summit this spring. Of course, COVID complicated that. But the summit was going to be built around the theme of One Illinois, Noble Aspiration or Impossible Dream, just playing on the differences of the various parts of our state, the struggle for kind of a singular state identity. And we could not think of a better person to have a kind of a good, robust discussion about this than Ameya Pawar, who has been a real leader in this whole movement, really, to think about Illinois as one coherent political entity. Ameya is from Chicago, but has a really kind of a statewide perspective. So Ameya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, let's begin just a little bit with your background. I know you're from Chicago. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about, the early years, college, first job, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so my dad came to the United States in 1972, settled in Chicago, spent the first 8 years of my life in Rogers Park in the north side of Chicago. And then we moved to the suburbs when I was 8, went to undergrad in a small town in central Missouri, Marshall, Missouri. So got to see sort of the urban-rural divide up close, felt it. And my first job in government was with the village of Riverside. I was working with the city manager and the city council, or the advisors there to move legislation, manage the small town, and eventually got into politics. But I've always been sort of interested in the race, class, geographical issues that have been used to divide the country, and to kind of use those as our strengths to say, we all kind of rise and fall together. How do we bring people together?
Well, let's talk about your time on the city council. You were an alderman for several terms. Tell us about the impetus for running and what it was like to be an alderman in Chicago.
I don't think anything prepares you for Chicago politics. It is bare knuckle, it is gritty, it is hard, but it's also incredibly fulfilling and rewarding. I got to learn how to pass legislation and build coalitions and work to bring people along, right, to pass public policy. My background before I was an alderman, I did research in the connection between disaster and poverty. And that's what really inspired me to run, was really Hurricane Katrina. I was watching people in power, media pundits, political analysts, blame people in New Orleans for failing to evacuate, without understanding why they couldn't evacuate, without understanding that if you don't have access to credit or financial services, or if your job isn't portable, or if you don't have anywhere to go, or if your familial network is rooted in that community, leaving at a moment's notice is impossible. So we don't measure the inherent strengths, but we're quick to blame people about why they do X, Y, and Z during a disaster. And, disasters and preparing for them is a local effort. And that's what got me into local politics, was how do you build resilient communities? How do you help strengthen communities block by block by understanding what's actually happening versus what you want to blame people for after something goes wrong? And Chicago politics is a great place to cut your teeth in politics, but also move legislation and learn how to build coalitions.
Well, in 2018, you decided to swing for the fences and run for governor, built very much on this theme of One Illinois. Tell us about that campaign, the impetus for joining, what your memories are, what are sort of the lingering implications of that race for you?
So I jumped into the race on January 3rd of 2017, so started that cycle very early. It was even a couple of weeks before President Trump was sworn in. But what I watched from 2014 through the presidential election in 2016 in Illinois was part of what I thought was a national and almost international trend, where you had very wealthy people running for office who were willing to divide communities against one another to sort of maintain the status quo. And the status quo being, very wealthy people do well, and everyone else has to fight over scraps. I was just amazed at how Governor Rauner went about his job. I felt that he was very quick to go downstate and talk about how terrible Chicago was, and then come to Chicago and, pit Chicago against the rest of the state. And frankly, he did more of it downstate than he did in Chicago. I think he was quick to paint Chicago as the enemy, suggesting that, the city got more than its fair share, that its culture and its people were fundamentally different, using sort of dog whistle type language. And, frankly, what he was doing was building on what had been taking root in politics for the last, since really Richard Nixon, right? This idea of the silent majority. Reagan kind of played that up with government being the enemy and kind of, talking about Reagan Democrats, which was really an appeal to the white working class, suggesting that Black and brown communities that were struggling were to blame for the struggles of the white working class, without any of us sort of zooming out and saying, maybe it's these global forces around trade and jobs and offshoring and automation were driving this instability. Instead of talking about that, Governor Rauner said, it's those people in Chicago, it's that teachers union, it's the fat cat government bureaucrats. And I found that to be offensive. And so I jumped into the race with $40,000 against a guy who's worth $1 billion. I knew what my odds were, but I really wanted to talk about divide and rule politics from the perspective of my own family's experience, given my dad was born under British colonial rule, and he experienced the impacts of what it was like to be growing up in a post-colonial environment, and then kind of overlay that against what Governor Rauner was doing, which was, obviously not using violence, but using political violence, in many ways, economic violence against communities.
Well, in the campaign, you must have had a real sense of just kind of the diversity of Illinois. And I know just in my own experience, when I start, a morning in Carbondale, going for my run on campus, and then, take the train up to Chicago and, spend my evening at Lakeshore Drive or Michigan Avenue. It's like, man, these are almost two different solar systems, let alone the same state. Do you have memories of just, maybe a day or two in the campaign trail where just the kind of the diversity of experiences almost, was palpable?
I mean, one of my favorite trips on the campaign was we took the Great River Road down from Galena to Cairo. And it was, it travels along the Mississippi River. And to me, I'd been to Galena to vacation and obviously was aware of how much there was to see there, but hadn't really ever traveled down that Great River Road, down through Rock Island and further south all the way to Cairo to see the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. It is stunning. We live in just an incredibly diverse state from an ecological and from a socio-political standpoint. That trip was just amazing to me. And when I met with Mayor Coleman, who was the mayor of Cairo at the time, I just felt a connection that this is the kind of campaign I want to run, which is to talk about, instead of dividing the state against itself, how do we unite it around all the great things we have to offer? And that trip really, for me, cemented, even traveling through East St. Louis and knocking on doors there, talking about disinvestment, but also meeting people with such great resiliency. It stuck with me. The campaign is personally, it was hard because I had a 10-month-old and my wife had to really carry the load. She really carried the load the entire time, working full time and with our 10-month-old. But it was personally difficult, but also rewarding in the sense that I got to meet so many incredible people around the state. And while a county may look red on a map because they voted Republican last time, at its core, when you knock on doors and talk to people, they're just people and they're just neighbors. And that to me sticks with me today.
Well, so when the campaign ended, you went back to Chicago, but one of the things you did is you developed an entity called One Illinois, a news entity, internet-based, that has some wonderful features on podcasts, long-form journalism, videos. Tell us about the inspiration of this and what you hope it does to kind of forge this notion of One Illinois.
Yeah, so the campaign theme was a New Deal for Illinois, right? Kind of inspired by FDR's New Deal. And the idea was to bring everyone together under this idea of One Illinois. The thinking behind One Illinois as a news site was, how do we tell stories about the things that we have in common? How do we tell stories and weave new narratives about what a great state we live in, and that if we cooperated and worked together, all the things that we can accomplish. There's a lot of news out there. There are a lot of news deserts that people call now because lots of small newspapers have closed or have been eaten up by private equity firms. And so information flow is sometimes very angry and cynical. And we wanted to kind of shift that and say, here's how we're connected as a state. Let's talk about those stories. Let's talk about sort of the ties that bind us. And then let's figure out how to unite, towards the common good, right? How do we work to properly fund education and public schools in Cairo and Decatur and in Chicago? How do we pass capital bills that impact Rock Island and Rockford and Charleston? And so we want to bring the state together, and we thought storytelling was a good way to do it in the absence of a political campaign.
Well, one of the videos I really liked on your website was, and you mentioned the Great River Road. My wife and I went there this summer. We're actually stayed near a place called Savannah. Mm-hmm. You have a wonderful feature about the a new bridge that was constructed across the Mississippi. Actually saw some great footage of the old one coming down. Yeah. But it was just a wonderful way of talking about the importance of infrastructure, which is a boring technical term, and showing in a really tangible way what that means.
Yeah. So Savannah, Illinois is really an incredible place. It's also just outside of town. You can go to the Mississippi Palisades State Park, some of the best hikes in Illinois, at least I would argue that. But that bridge connected Savannah to Sabula, Iowa, which if you ever take that bridge over, there's a really wonderful ice cream shop that's right on the river there. It's kind of a fantastic little place. But that bridge, the old bridge was quite scary. It had been built, I think, in the 1920s, and needed significant repair. And, the new bridge that went up was funded by a capital bill, and with cooperation with the state of Iowa. And it demonstrates what it means when two states work together, what it means when communities work together to connect themselves, and what that means from an economic standpoint, whether you're bringing in tourists from Iowa or whether you're sending folks over the border, that, again, we rise and fall together. And when we invest in one another, great things happen. When we divide ourselves against one another, well, we end up fighting over scraps.
Well, and you have this other great video with Senator Durbin, in which you had an extensive conversation. And one of the things you asked him is about the regional differences in Illinois. And he made the interesting point that he said these differences have always been there, of course, but he had a particular degree of animosity towards politicians who make their careers on just exacerbating these differences and fomenting them. Tell me a little bit about what you took away from your conversation with Senator Durbin.
I mean, Senator Durbin's for me, St. Louis. And he is fully aware of what happens when politics is used to divide, white communities against Black and brown communities, and so on and so forth. And he was frustrated because, we're human beings. We're flawed. We have, we have our most base instincts, which is survival, and survival sometimes leads us to act and behave in ways we wouldn't want to. But we also know better, right? But when you have politics that channel that sort of base instinct, which is I need to protect what's mine against that outsider, or that those people over there are the reason why I'm struggling over here, that is human. But when you channel that and you weaponize that, it has a corrosive impact on society. I mean, look, for example, today with the coronavirus. You have a president who's really channeled those base instincts, suggesting that people who live in big cities are these elites who don't care about the working person outside of big cities. And we've now he's weaponized that narrative and made a public health issue a political issue. Masks have become political. That is what happens when you channel people's base instincts, and history shows us this over and over again, right? And I think his frustration is that when you're an elected official, you have to be better than that. What you have to be able to do is inspire people to say, I know what you might be thinking inside because you've had it tough, but we need to come together as people and stop dividing ourselves. That's what an elected leader is supposed to do. It's very cheap and frankly easy to get people to act on something that's inside of them that we normally wouldn't act on. So children do that, right? My toddler, or when she was a toddler, would have very base reactions to things. But as she gets older, she knows, hey, maybe I shouldn't do that or think about it that way. So long-winded way of saying, I think he was frustrated with how corrosive the politics have become as a result of some of the narratives that Nixon started weaving, Reagan took on, and even going into Bruce Rauner and today with President Trump.
Well, Ameya, we were in the summit we were designing. We wanted to have an interactive component with students, and we're trying to put together an exercise. And one idea I came up with, which I think in retrospect was not a good idea, was I was looking at some legislation that had been introduced by just a handful of lawmakers, and it was a completely message bill in which it would, effectively, kick Chicago out of the state of Illinois, make it the 51st state. Obviously never going to pass, never even get a hearing, totally designed for message and kind of, tossing red meat. Initially, I thought maybe, using this bill might be a constructive way to kind of talk about the divisions within Illinois. But I actually was chatting with a professor from Illinois Wesleyan who I think wisely cautioned. He said, you're actually giving this bill more credence than it deserves. You're actually kind of, you're walking into the trap, which is giving it a kind of significance that it doesn't merit. Tell me how you react to that.
In 4 years ago, I would have thought that this was sort of a fringe effort, right? Sort of pandering to a very narrow band of folks. Today, I still am very optimistic. I mean, I believe people are inherently good, right? And I think people, I don't think people wish ill on their neighbors or fellow citizens. I don't think they are born that way. I think there are instincts in us that make us sometimes do things we wouldn't do, but I think generally speaking, people are good. When I hear about some of the initiatives to separate Chicago and Illinois, I want to just cite a conversation I once had with Governor Edgar, Republican. So my politics are much further to the left of him, but I was part of the inaugural Edgar Fellows program in 2012, and there was 40 of us that came from bipartisan backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different parts of the state, to build relationships so that we could solve problems as we grew into leaders in and around the state. And he took all 40 of us, to a working farm outside of Champaign. And we got there, we took a tour, we learned from the farmers. And the farmer was actually quite interesting. He had a pretty sophisticated trading operation in one of his barns, right? So you have tractors, and then you have a pretty sophisticated operation connected to the financial markets, right? So he's able to, so all the people who sometimes suggest that people in rural communities, are XYZ, or people in the city are A, B, C, that, there's a lot more we have in common than you would expect. But Governor Edgar turned to those of us from Chicago and said, just understand that if this gentleman's farm does not produce a profitable crop, those markets that you have on LaSalle Street do not work, right? That this farm contributes to the wealth and the economic development that you see on LaSalle Street and downtown and the surrounding areas. And then he turned to everyone else who was from around the state and said, and similarly, we should not penalize or look down on Chicago for getting capital money to improve the CTA and other infrastructure improvements, because without Chicago, there's nowhere for this farmer to sell his crops. His point was connected, and see those connections and see our common bond. Movements to these bills to separate the state, I would say, it's unfortunate to watch people do this, but I am optimistic and hopeful, and hope people channel their better angels so that we can work together.
But it was interesting as kind of a follow-up to this, because I had been approached by a reporter from the Chicago Tribune or Sun-Times to comment on a meeting that was going to be taking place, I think, in Effingham, in which there was a group that was, on this, pushing this same agenda. And at that point, I wasn't particularly plugged into this group, and I didn't know that I had too much to offer, so I declined. But I guess I'm sort of wondering if in moments like that, you should use the occasion to speak out kind of loudly against it, or whether you should just say, just kind of say in a kind of a simpler, quieter way, I think this is a fringe movement that doesn't really deserve the credence that it's trying to get. I mean, do you have a general way of trying to figure out or how to engage this sort of a movement?
What it reminds me of is whether it's QAnon, whether it is conspiracy theories in general or separate. By the time the legislation is introduced, we're already reacting. I think it's important to push back and to bring people together, but that should be a continuous effort. It's not an electoral strategy, meaning we shouldn't be showing up in communities and organizing and talking to people when it's time to ask them for their vote. What we should be doing is spending time well in advance of elections and make it less about politics, but more about building relationships. Before people get to a point where they see conspiracy or they have animosity or even anger or hatred in some cases towards their neighbors. To me, narrative around community, about being neighbors, about rising and falling together, this is work that happens every day, right? Every day we have to see our connections between Chicago and downstate and vice versa. That's the hard work, because riling people up and getting them angry, thinking about conspiracies, that's easy to do when there's a void, when there isn't active work happening. So my point is, I think it's important to push back. I think it's important to assign it to a fringe element, but I also think we should also come at it from a place of empathy and say, what do we need to do to start working together? And then how do we do that over the long term? I understand you're angry where you are now. I understand you might see this as a conspiracy, but how do we bring people back is where I think we should focus our efforts instead of labeling them as fringe.
You and I have talked about this before, but one thing that I think maybe intrigues both of us is whether some of these divisions in Illinois are just very specific to Illinois, or to what extent they're just kind of reflective of what's happening across the country. Minnesota is not as big as Illinois, of course, but it has, a major, 2 cities and then a rural component. Pennsylvania obviously has 2 big cities. So, I mean, is Illinois this kind of these regional differences, to what extent is it due to just very specific, unique factors to Illinois? And to what extent does it just reflect this broader urban-rural kind of disconnect that seems to have been exacerbated in recent years?
I think in Illinois, it's been, I think there's the unique factor is that we had a governor who was, looking to inflame those divides and try to channel people's worst instincts. Look, my wife is from Evanston, Illinois, right, which is right outside of the city of Chicago. It's where Northwestern University is. And there's a divide between Evanstonians and Northwestern, right? That's ever present. Yeah. My point is, these divides exist, whether you're talking about campus divides in the community, urban, rural. It's natural for people to be tribal in some ways. That's just, we're human beings. That's what we do. We pick teams. We do things like that. It's unique in Illinois because, again, as I said, Governor Rauner actually tried to use that divide and rule approach to exact policies to bust pensions and to bust unions. So he wanted to use that. It was a tactic. And he used a tactic that's really been used, for millennia. When I talked about my parents, for example, my dad was born in India under British rule. What the British did was they divided a majority against the minority. I'm sorry, they used the minority to rule over a majority. And what they did is they used geography, caste, and religion, economic circumstances as sort of wedges, right? Now, fast forward to Governor Rauner, he's saying, if you're south of I-80 versus Chicago, right? Finding those wedges, that's what people who want to divide do, right? It's easy, right? It's unique in Illinois in that way, but I think it's something that's common everywhere. And I think what you need to do is elect people who are going to bring people together, even when you have really big problems.
How do you think COVID has affected the kind of sense of one Illinois? I mean, particularly, in Southern Illinois, there's been sometimes during the early parts of COVID, the sense that the governor was putting together a kind of blanket policy that maybe was more relevant to Chicago than it was downstate. Of course, as events unfold, we realize down here that we're every bit as susceptible to the virus as people are in Chicago. Yeah. But do you think that's enhanced regional tensions and fissures?
Yeah, I think in some ways, yes, and some no. I think the sad part is our federal government, particularly the White House, took an approach early on of messaging around this idea that it was only those people in the cities that were really getting sick, right? Remember, it was really Black and brown communities, people who lived multi-generational households. They're using lots of code words to suggest it couldn't happen in rural communities. But what we really find out now is that, socioeconomics, exposure to environmental pollution, poverty, access to healthcare, or the lack of it, in many ways are one of the drivers of this, right? And so if you don't have access to healthcare, if you don't have access if you're in an area that's seen environmental degradation, et cetera, down the line, that you are more vulnerable to this. And what we know is that there are an equal amount of vulnerability in Chicago and in Black and brown communities as there is in communities that are predominantly white that have also been struggling because of deindustrialization, right? And a lack of jobs and an increase in poverty, right? So what we should have been focused on is what are the issues that drive vulnerability? And we know that poverty, social vulnerability does. And that's not just Black or white, it is Black, brown, and white. And that's where we should have been focusing the intensity of our efforts. But instead it was, it's over there in Chicago, you don't need to worry about it. And now here we are. We've politicized a public health response, and that's tragic.
Well, what is your most hopeful scenario looking out over the next half decade about this effort to both address with the income inequality issue, but also to get a more coherent sense of Illinois?
Young people. I mean, there was a Black Lives Matter processional in El Dorado, right? And I don't think I'm saying it right. It's El Dorado, right? And that was a sundown town, right? And so I'm watching young people around the state and the country and the world lead on issues related to social, economic, and racial justice, on environmental justice that we're not doing as adults, right? Young on so many issues. They're seeing things less Black, brown, and saying, wait a minute, environment, this is going to impact us, right? Access to clean water or rising floodwaters or heat waves. These are issues that are going to impact us equally. The color of our skin, you can try dividing us based on that, but this is going to impact all of us. So I see young people organizing in small towns and big cities, and that is inspiring, truly. It's not cliche. It's not something I've seen. And, when I was the young guy in politics 10 years ago, I didn't see so much of that, right? I think people were organizing, but there were still factions. And now young people are just saying, call us what you want, call us DSA, call us Democrats, call us liberals, whatever. We are organizing because organizing around climate change is for the common good. Organizing around racial justice is not Democrat or Republican. It's just the right thing to do. And that for me gives me hope, because I feel like a lot of the adults in society have failed us, all of us. We failed each other. And so I want to lean on them.
Well, and finally, tell us a little bit about what contribution you want to make to this debate, both through your website, your teaching, your political work. I mean, how would you like to be a part of this effort over the next several years?
I mean, I just want people, I think I want to encourage young people to run for office, particularly women, particularly young people of color. Your voice is desperately needed. I also think that one of the things we need to do in organizing the state, not just from a political perspective, but organizing so that we can see our common needs and our common goals, is to not discount what's happened in predominantly white communities around the state, right? So I think one of the things I try to do as a person of color, as an Asian American, as a Democrat, is to say that this is inequality impacts Black, white, and brown communities. There are structural problems that impact some communities more than others. But at the end of the day, our goal should be to lift everyone up and not exclude the voices of one group over the other, and not prioritize one over the other, is to kind of say we rise and fall together. And so what I hope to do is continue this conversation, continue trying to bring people together, and appealing to our better angels for a better politics. I think the politics of Donald Trump have an expiration date, hopefully in 19 days, but also I think that type of divisive politics, as you see young people organize around the country and the world, has an expiration date. And I want to be a part of helping young people mobilize, pass legislation, and make this a more fair and just society.
Well, thanks so much. Well, we're hoping to have our summit next year, and we'd love to have you come down. Maybe you could take a little detour through the great River Road and come down to Carbondale and meet with some of the students and just outline this vision of yours. We'd love to have you.
I'd love that. I'm due for another visit to the Makanda Inn, so I'm definitely.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Ameya. We really enjoyed visiting with you, and we will be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.